about how to put your garden to bed for the winter and support the local ecosystem. Those of us that like to grow a lot of native plants are usually trying to help support the local ecosystem, the health of the nature in our community, which is wonderful. And we can do an awesome job using a lot of native plants. But when it comes time in the fall to put our gardens to bed for the winter, that can have a really drastic effect on the health and population levels of beneficial insects. And this talk, I'm going to be focusing on beneficial insects, but all of the features that I talk about to support them will also support a lot of other wildlife in your neighborhood. So again, we like to focus on doing as many native plants as possible, a fairly high percentage in our yard. And it really does help to go a long way to encourage a vibrant and healthy ecosystem in our community, both especially the beneficial insects and native pollinators. However, a lot of us are taught to clean our garden beds up for the winter. Cut everything back, get rid of all the stems and stalks, heavily mulch the garden. And it basically turns our garden into like this huge desert during a time of year that our insect friends need a lot of shelter and protection. And so if we do this, if we clean our garden beds up like this, then what we're doing is we're destroying hundreds or thousands of the insect population that we're trying to encourage in our community. And so what we need to do is to learn to tolerate a little bit of messiness and learn what features are really beneficial to add to our garden to encourage the beneficial insects in our yard. Now, insects can overwinter as eggs or larvae or pupa or as adults. And they find protection in a lot of different places. They're like within the fallen leaves, they're under the logs and rocks, they're under loose bark, they're in wood cavities and beetle burrows, they're in bare or undisturbed soil, in abandoned rodent burrows, in hollow or pithy stems, and sometimes they're just camouflaged in plain sight. Now, I encourage people to use natural features as much as possible to support the insect community rather than just using like man-made nest boxes. And that's for several reasons. One is that the stalks, like if we're encouraging the use of flower stalks and bramble stalks and other stems to provide nesting sites, they will eventually break down over time naturally, and that helps reduce the beneficial insects exposure to either parasites or to disease. And a lot of times if we're using man-made nest boxes, they're out there for years. We often don't take really good care of them, and they can actually increase pests and diseases among our populations. And if we're creating garden beds that provide the resources that the beneficial insects need, it often provides a much higher density of what they're looking for. So it's going to go more towards helping to increase the population. And you can also combine the same features can be used that will also support songbirds and other wildlife. And when we're supporting our beneficial insects, here's a selection of variety of other wildlife that we can support at the same time. You notice I did not include deer. I have no wish to encourage them at the moment. There's plenty of them around. Okay, so one of the first things that we'll focus on is using leaf litter for mulch compared to other types of mulch. A lot of us use shredded bark mulch because it's easy to apply, it's easily available. It does a good job of suppressing weeds and preserving moisture. But shredded bark mulch is pretty heavy and it's quite dense, and it makes it pretty difficult for a lot of insects to burrow into it or to find the soil below it. it's not a natural mulch that our insects and wildlife are well adapted to. We certainly use it to a certain extent, but we do not want to emphasize that in our own flower beds. Now, leaf litter, on the other hand, let's see if I can, there we go, is a lighter natural mulch that birds and insects find a lot more useful. And when my sister and I switched from bark mulch to leaf mulch, we noticed a lot more activity of songbirds in our garden beds. They just seemed to find a lot more food, and they found it easier to hunt and search for what they were looking for in this lighter mixed leaf mulch than we did in the shredded bark mulch. Yeah, the towhees really liked it too. Now, the vast majority of our moths and butterflies actually use leaf litter to camouflage and protect their eggs, their larvae, their pupa, or as adults. And some butterflies, like the red-banded hair streaks, lay their eggs on the fallen oak leaves. And after these eggs overwinter in the leaf litter, when the larva hatches in the spring, the first thing they start eating is the leaves that they were laid on. Now, you get other instances where this is a chrysalis of the swallowtail butterfly, and it's designed to mimic leaves in the area to help camouflage it. And this is a bumblebee queen, and it's looking for a nesting site in the soil underneath the leaves. And it's not going to be quite as attractive to a dense cover of the bark mulch. Now, when it comes time to handle the leaves in the fall, it's a good idea as much as possible to let the leaves remain where they have fallen. But if you do need to collect them and move them, then try to avoid shredding the leaves or using really strong blowers, because either of those options can kill a lot of the insects that are sheltering among the leaves. So it's a good idea to use raking or some vacuuming the leaves, because that's gentler on the insects that might be among them. Also, if you've got a lot more leaves than you can comfortably fit on your garden beds, I encourage you to find a location, an out-of-the-way location on your property, just pile them up and let them slowly rot over time. That's not only, I mean, insects will make use of it as they see fit, birds and other animals will make use of it as they see fit.
Snakes.
But as it, including snakes, they will rot down, and generally over about a 2 years time period, you'll end up with some really nice leaf compost, which I found very useful in the garden. So. Another feature to think about is using rocks and logs to provide nesting sites and shelter. We don't happen to have any extra rocks on our small lot, but we had to cut down several large trees, and we made a point to save a number of logs and small branches to spread out in different parts of our property. And there's a log here, but if you'll notice on the ground in front of it, you'll see a whole bunch of pieces of shredded wood, rotting wood. That's actually from the oak tree up above. I think some woodpeckers are like really digging into some branches of that oak tree. But if you don't have access to like larger logs, these are pretty heavy. If they weren't cut down on the property, I don't think we'd bother moving them on site. You can use smaller branches and set them down on the ground. And a lot of beetles and other bugs will find shelter underneath them. And a lot of other animals will hunt and find around them too. And if you don't have big branches, you can just choose small sections of wood and just pile them up. And they still offer a lot of the same benefits. They do provide shelter underneath, especially for predatory ground beetles. They really love that. Another feature to think about is loose bark, beetle tunnels, and wood cavities. So this tends to lean towards like older rotting trees or rotting logs and things like that. So here's one of the logs that we've got lying on our ground, and here's a lot of beetle tunnels. And these tunnels can provide housing and shelter for beneficial insects and native bees. This log has been rotting for quite a while. This is not on our property. And you'll see there is a woolly bear caterpillar that's looking for a nice sheltered niche to hide in over the winter time. This is a old box elder tree on our property. We weren't planning on keeping it because it's kind of a trash tree. And we don't really like it a whole lot, but we discovered there were bird nest holes that were being used in the main trunk. And so we decided we had to cut back the main branches because they were in the way of building our house. So we had it cut back so it was maybe 10 foot above the ground. And we retained all of the nesting sites. And so it's still alive. It's going to be slowly dying off. And as you can see, they're digging out more holes. There is bark that's rotting and falling off. There are more beetle tunnels. And so all of this loose bark provides more hiding places for insects. And all these nooks and crannies provide more sources of shelter. And all of the insects that are hanging out on this tree and eating in this tree are sources of food for our birds. We also had to cut down this oak tree, kind of a middle-aged tree. And we asked them to cut it down about 11 foot above the ground, which they thought was kind of weird. But we went ahead and put a owl nest box up near the top. And this tree, this stump is like a little bit alive. It's kind of struggling, but it's really mostly starting to die. And we've been starting to harvest oyster mushrooms that have been being produced on this trunk. And I'm starting to watch woodpeckers and other birds that are starting to feed on insects that are growing, that are living inside this tree trunk. Another thing to strongly consider is to create patches of bare or undisturbed soil on your property. We've probably got about 4,000 species of native bees, and 70% of them nest in the ground. So this is really important. If we want to encourage our native pollinators, we really need to think about encouraging nesting sites in the soil. And so here's a couple of nest sites for these native pollinators. They often prefer well-drained, sandy or loamy soil. And they prefer not too many plants, and certainly not much mulch at all. They prefer bare soil. They prefer a south slope or a sunny location, something with a little bit of warmth, definitely well-drained. You don't want to have it in a soggy location. And these bees tend to be pretty non-aggressive. You almost have to like pinch them or really threaten them for them to even to try stinging you. It's pretty unusual for somebody to get stung by these solitary native bees. Usually it's just one female that's creating a nest in each of these holes, and you might have a number of holes in the area, but they're all doing their own thing. And here's one bee that's coming out of the ground. This soil looks like it's a little moisture, maybe a little bit more clay, but it's still somewhat loose, enough to create those little lumps and particles. Now here, my sister and I ran into this colony. It was in a hillside. This is very, very dense, heavy clay. It's well drained. But this bee colony was actually digging its way into the hillside. We had a lovely little colony of native bees in that location. And when we had our property graded and the hillside dug into to create a retaining wall, we had a bank of really hard subsoil clay that was exposed for like 2 or 3 months. And we actually had a few pollinator bees that were starting to create nests inside that cut open bank of clay. So there are some options. You probably have some way to create ground nesting bee sites on your property. It's got to be mostly bare of plants, as sunny and dry as possible, and give them a go. Most of these nests are located several inches below the surface, and they're usually only active for a few weeks of the year. The females do their thing, they're busy for a few weeks, and then everything's shut down, and the larvae and pupae just kind of hang out in there until next spring. And some pollinators, this is a squash bee, and it pollinates our squashes and melons and cucumbers. And they're very specific. They really like squash flowers. But this bee is also pretty specific in that it likes to nest right at the base of the plants it's been pollinating. So if you want to encourage squash bees in your garden, it's a good idea to not do a lot of tilling or plowing below these plants that winter or any time before like mid-May the next year. You want to give them a chance to go through their whole process. It's usually most of a year before they're ready to come out and start doing their thing again. In fact, most of these bees, the native bees, whether they're tunnelers in plant material or whether they're ground dwellers, they like to be fairly close to their forage sources where they're getting their pollen and their nectar. And so providing nesting sites near where you've got the flowers and the meadows that are providing the pollen and nectar is a really good idea. It helps them off a lot. They don't have to go travel super far to be able to get the food to feed their young. This is a blue-winged wasp. And we first identified this in our garden about 6 years ago. I noticed this wasp just kept going into the ground in our raised garden beds. We had fairly soft soil there, well drained. He would go in the ground and come back up and move over and go in the ground and come back up again. And I was going, what on earth is this wasp doing? And we finally looked it up and we found out that this one like lays eggs on the grubs of the beetles that's in the soil. And at that point they're fairly new gardens, we're having some serious grub issues and we're going, yes, go for it. Those wasps are really helping us out trying to help control our grubs. We also found out that they really, really love feeding on our hoary mountain mint. We've got a big patch of it on our new lot, and it was covered with these blue-winged wasps this year. So that's one plant that you can use to encourage them. I think there's quite a few of these wasps in this area. I think I'm even seeing them in Beth's garden. Now, this is a rodent tunnel in the ground. And bumblebees often will nest in like rodent tunnels, abandoned tunnels. They will often nest in old neglected bird houses, things that provide shelter and a small area. And so this needs to be in a location that's not disturbed a lot. You don't want it mowed a lot. You don't want it tilled up very much. It's really good to have portions of your lot that you are not doing much tilling, much traveling, much mowing, something where nature can actually do its thing peacefully. Now, here's a hard thing. I used to really like cutting down my garden in the fall and making it really pretty and neat and everything. And once I discovered how damaging that is to the beneficial insects that I love so much, I've had to learn to tolerate a bit of messiness. That's just part of nature. Nature really thrives on something that's a bit less organized and less neat than what a lot of our gardeners really like. So the plants that have hollow or pithy stems or branches offer probably better options for some of the nesting for the tunneling type pollinators. So blackberries and raspberries, sumac, elderberry, roses, daylilies, the stems, yucca, the sedums, the bee balms, goldenrods, coneflowers, and a bunch of more. All you gotta do is just cut through the stems, and if they're hollow or if they've got pithy centers, they're usually pretty usable for a lot of different pollinators. Now, these are daylilies, and I used to just make sure once it was done flowering, I would yank those or cut off those flowering stalks and just get them out of there. I didn't like the look of it. I wanted just to have the leaves. But now that I really want to encourage my beneficials, I'll just kind of cut them back and leave the open holes available for the insects that might want to use them. This is a blackberry stalk that's been cut back, and that tends to have a pithy center, and blackberries and raspberries are pretty popular with a lot of different tunneling insects. Here is a stem that's been broken off, and it had a pithy center, and this insect, this bee, is some leaf cutter bee, tunneled into it, put its babies in there, and sealed off the entrance with the cut leaves it collected. And here's what some of the chambers often look like. They'll tunnel down into the stalk, and they have separate chambers, and they lay an egg, and they put a food source in. And for some insects, it's going to be pollen. For other insects, it's going to be a paralyzed insect, like the spider wasp will sting and paralyze a spider and stick it in each chamber for the babies to feed on. And when they're ready, usually the following year, then they will chew their way out and start the next generation. And there's many different kinds of tunnelers, and they seal their entrances with all different materials. Some are resin, some are mud, some are leaves. You can often get a good feeling for the type of insect that's in there by what they're using to seal up the tunnels. Now, might be a little hard to see this, but this is a yucca plant, and this is the flowering stalk in the center. And this bloomed earlier this year. And apparently we had some insects start laying eggs and forming larvae and maybe even pupa inside that stalk. And a bird came along and found it already, and it just tore off the side and went into each of those chambers, and it fished out the larva or pupa, and it had a feast. So that's pretty common. That happens a lot. So it's like we're trying to encourage the insects, but they do feed the birds too. Now, galls are another way that insects are sheltered over the winter time. Like on the left, it is goldenrod gall, and on the right is a gall on a particular type of willow tree. There's other galls on leaves. And the swelling is caused by a particular type of gall insect, which irritates the tissues and creates the swelling. And it actually has a nice little home inside. And so they often develop to a certain point, and they may or may not overwinter in it. And there may be parasites that find them. And so you may have a parasite move inside. And sometimes there's even, I think they call them hyperparasites, parasites of the parasites. So you might have like 2 or 3 levels of insects that can live in there. But sometimes if a particular insect survives the winter in there, other animals will find them, and they will chew the galls open, and they will feast on the protein and fat-rich insects that are inside. Like there's galls on oak leaves that squirrels sometimes chew into to get the protein that they need during the winter time. Now, here is a chart that shows when different types of native bees are active in an orchard, in eastern apple orchard. It might be, this might be the Northeast. They didn't make it really clear what part of the eastern US it is. I suspect it's the Northeast. And you'll notice that a lot of the fruits are blooming, fruit trees are blooming from like very late March to mid-May. And that's a pretty prime time where a lot of the different pollinators are going to be active. And you'll notice some are barely coming out and becoming active in the middle of the apple and pear season, which is like early May. Others will have already started in early March, and some of them will remain active throughout the year, and others quit very early on. So just be aware that during like the apple and pear season is when there's quite a few of these native pollinators that are active. And if you're trying to clean up your garden beds, let's say you didn't cut down all the branches in the fall, all the stems, but you started cutting them all down like early March. You had a nice spring day, you're getting spring fever, you want to get your garden going. If you cut them all down and get rid of them in like early March, you've just wiped out most of the population. So it's a good idea to wait until like May before you remove most of the branches and stems that could be providing shelters for these different pollinators. So what you can do is leave the stems alone through the winter and don't do any pruning on them until like March. And then you can prune the stems back to maybe 8 to 24 inches in height. And it's good to vary the heights because then you often get varied size stems and varied size holes for insects to select from. It's a good idea to not reduce it to less than 8 inches in height, preferably at least 4 to 6 inches above a branch or a side shoot because that kind of closes off the tunnels at that section. Because, and the reason we need to have some of the reasons we need to have that length or that height is because some of the pollinators need a fairly deep tunnel to use, because they put some of their female eggs in a certain portion and male eggs in another portion, and if it's too short of a tunnel, then they may get the wrong ratios of females to male, often too many males, not enough females. So they really need to have long enough things. And that's one of the disadvantages of a lot of the commercial nest blocks. A lot of them, the hole depths are only like 3.5 inches. And that's often way too short to get a proper healthy sex ratio for these insects. So you'd, in the late winter, you'd like prune it down, and you'd have all of these holes and stuff ready for the spring pollinators to be coming out and looking for a new nesting site. And then they're going to do their thing, and they're going to lay all their eggs and get all their populations set up in these stems. And then you want to just let the plants grow and let those stems stay there, the cut back stems, because it's going to be most of a year for those insects that are going to be living in those stems up until the following spring before they're ready to hatch out and start a new generation. And ideally, you would leave those older prune stems that had just finished, you know, supporting another generation, let them rot down on their own over time. But if you really want to remove the older stems completely, wait until at least mid-May. And then place the cut stems in a very loose open pile, so if there's anything still in there, it has a chance to hatch and get out. Now, shrubs are usually pruned immediately after blossoming, and that's so that they will develop new blossoms and you won't be cutting off the following year's blossoms. Brambles, you usually prune the 2-year-old stems right after harvest, because they're going to die anyway. The 2-year-old stems are the ones that fruit, and as soon as they fruit, they're dead for the most part. And so you can either wait until the following spring to prune them back, or you can go ahead and prune them partway down right after harvest so that they're not in the way, because they're so thorny. I don't like a big mass of thorny brambles. So that's kind of a compromise I would do with that one. Now, stems that are being used by insects are usually sealed at the open end with one thing or another. However, sometimes adult insects will seek winter protection inside the open tunnels, and they won't seal the open end. So simply because the end is open doesn't mean that there may not be an insect sheltering inside. And here's one large garden bed where they just let the flower stalks stay out all winter. And this particular variety looks pretty good. One of the things that I take into consideration when deciding how to handle the pruning back of the flowers is, my sister and I discovered, especially with our rain garden we had a few years ago, some plants self-seed almost invasively, even if they're native plants. They just sow and produce thousands of babies and create a huge mess. And so for a lot of them, we've gone ahead and deadheaded a lot of those as soon as they finished flowering before they started throwing seeds out, because we really didn't want or need that many young plants around. And we just cut it back enough to cut the seeds off, but we could still leave the stalks there to be used by the insects. So that's just one thing to kind of keep in mind. Now, this time of year is a really good time of year to go throughout your community and look for late blooming flowers that support pollinators. One of the things we want to do is to provide flowers that blossom from really early spring to very late fall, to support our native pollinators. And this is asters. You can see a bee on this one. They're usually blooming September, sometimes into October. Here's a different kind of aster and a different kind of goldenrod. I think these were blooming in September. Here's another goldenrod. There's a couple of wasps on this one, and I think they sometimes go into October. Depends upon the variety. There's so many varieties of goldenrod out there. And here's a syrphid fly on top of a chrysanthemum. Here's a honeybee on top of another chrysanthemum. And this is in the late fall. And here is another chrysanthemum given to us by Carol Schwabel. And it's covered with bees and flies. I think some of these might be taconid flies. And this picture was taken like 4 days before Thanksgiving. This is like the 3rd week of November. And this flower was still providing, it's not native, but for plants that provide a lot of pollen and nectar at times of years where there's not a lot of other options out there, and especially if it's not very invasive, I will do domesticated plants. And this chrysanthemum has been absolutely incredible, supporting pollinators very late into the season. Now, if you're thinking about reducing your lawn size, autumn is a really great time to do that, because all you need to do is lay down some cardboard on top of the grass and cover it with a deep layer of fallen leaves. And by next spring, that area should mostly be ready to plant. Now, mind you, if you've got invasive weeds or quackgrass or other things, this really won't work. But for regular lawns and things that aren't highly invasive, this is a pretty easy way to get another garden site established. So, so this is what we need to think about when it comes time to trying to get our gardens put to bed for the winter time. What can we do to support the insect life and all of the other wildlife in the area? Don't create a desert. Do whatever you can to support them. So do any of you have any questions? I don't hear anybody.
Okay, wait a minute. You'll have to get back to.
I'm trying.